What motivates a soldier to risk his life, knowing that death may be the only reward? Imagine standing at the base of a towering stone wall, the air thick with smoke, the ground beneath your feet trembling from the crash of battering rams and the thunderous roar of thousands of men locked in mortal combat. In your hands, you grip the rough wooden rungs of a siege ladder, its frame slick with the blood of the men who climbed before you, men who never reached the top. Above you, the defenders hurl stones the size of a man's head, loose arrows that darken the sky like a plague of locusts, and pour boiling oil that sears flesh from bone. Every instinct in your body screams at you to turn back, to fall in line with the ranks behind you, to let someone else be the first to ascend into that howling furnace of violence. And yet, something deeper stirs within you, a hunger that defies reason, a thirst that no amount of fear can quench. It is the desire for glory. It is the dream of immortality, not of the body, but of the name. In ancient Rome, there existed a tradition so dangerous, so revered, and so deeply woven into the fabric of military culture that it defined what it meant to be a soldier, a citizen, and a man. It was the act of being the first to scale the enemy's wall during a siege, the first to plant your feet on the battlements, the first to look the defenders in the eye, and the first to fight, utterly alone, surrounded by enemies who wanted nothing more than to kill you before your comrades could follow. This single act, lasting perhaps only seconds, could transform an ordinary legionary into a legend. It could elevate a man born in the gutter to the highest circles of Roman society. It could earn him the most coveted military decoration in the ancient world. But it could also, and far more often did, earn him nothing but an unmarked grave beneath a foreign wall. This is the story of that tradition. This is the story of the men who dared to climb. To understand why a single act of bravery on a siege ladder mattered so profoundly, one must first understand the nature of siege warfare itself, and the central role it played in Rome's relentless expansion across the Mediterranean world. Rome was not built in a day, as the old saying goes, but neither was it built solely on the open battlefield. For every Cannae or Zama great pitched battles fought on sweeping plains, there were dozens of sieges, grinding and brutal affairs in which Roman legions surrounded fortified cities and sought to break them open by force, by starvation, or by sheer determination. Siege warfare was, in many ways, the backbone of Roman imperialism. When Rome's enemies retreated behind their walls, as they so often did, the legions could not simply march past and declare victory. A fortified city left unconquered was a wound in the flank, a base from which the enemy could strike supply lines, rally resistance, and undermine Roman authority. The walls had to fall. The city had to be taken, and so the legions settled in, constructing circumvallation lines, rings of trenches and fortifications that encircled the besieged city, cutting off food, water, and hope. Engineers built siege towers, enormous wooden structures sheathed in raw hides to resist fire, designed to roll up to the walls and disgorge soldiers directly onto the battlements. Battering rams, some of them massive constructions requiring dozens of men to operate, pounded at gates and weak points in the masonry. Miners dug tunnels beneath foundations, hoping to collapse entire sections of wall. And when all else failed, or when a commander deemed the moment ripe, the assault ladders came out, and the order was given for a direct escalade of frontal assault on the walls themselves. It was the most dangerous phase of any siege, and it was during this phase that the tradition of the first man on the wall found its fullest and most terrifying expression. The escalade was, in essence, a controlled act of madness. Soldiers advanced across open ground under withering fire, carrying ladders that they propped against walls that could be 30, 40, even 50 feet high. They climbed in full armor, shields strapped to their backs, swords clenched between their teeth or hanging from their belts, entirely exposed and unable to fight back until they reached the top. The defenders above had every advantage: height, cover, and an arsenal of devastating weapons. Stones could shatter a man's skull through his helmet. Arrows could find the gaps in his armor at point-blank range. Boiling water, Heated sand and burning pitch could turn a living man into a screaming torch. And even if a soldier survived the climb, he arrived at the top exhausted, disoriented, and alone, facing fresh defenders who had been waiting for precisely this moment. The mathematics of the escalade were merciless. The first men up the ladder almost always died. And yet they climbed. They climbed because Rome asked it of them, and because Rome rewarded those who answered. At the heart of this reward system stood one of the most extraordinary military decorations ever conceived by any civilization, ancient or modern, the corona moralis, the wall crown. This was not merely a medal or a ribbon. It was a crown, fashioned from gold, sculpted to resemble the battlements of a city wall, complete with miniature turrets and crenellations. It was worn on the head, visible to all, a proclamation that its bearer had done what few men dared and fewer survived. The corona moralis was awarded to the first Roman soldier to scale the wall of an enemy city during an assault and establish a foothold on the battlements. The criteria were exacting and the verification rigorous. It was not enough to simply climb the wall. One had to be the first, and one had to fight and survive long enough for the claim to be validated by witnesses, fellow soldiers, and officers who could attest to the deed. In a military culture that valued collective discipline above almost all else, the corona moralis was a remarkable exception, a celebration of individual daring that elevated one man above his comrades and proclaimed his superiority in the most public and unmistakable fashion imaginable. To wear the wall crown was to announce to every Roman who saw you that you had stared death in the face at the top of a siege ladder and had not flinched. Its prestige in Roman society can scarcely be overstated. The Roman military decoration system was elaborate, with crowns and awards for various feats of valor. The corona civica for saving a fellow citizen's life in battle, the corona obsidianalis for lifting a siege, the corona navalis for valor in naval combat. But the corona moralis occupied a special place in the hierarchy of honor. It was, in modern terms, something akin to the Medal of Honor, the Victoria Cross, and a knighthood rolled into one. Its recipient was not merely honored, he was transformed. He became a public figure, a man whose name was spoken with reverence in the forum, whose presence at a banquet elevated the entire gathering, whose descendants would invoke his achievement for generations as proof of their family's worth. The wall crown was, in the deepest sense, a passport to social immortality, and it is impossible to understand the willingness of Roman soldiers to climb those terrible ladders without understanding the magnitude of the prize that awaited them at the top. Perhaps no siege in Roman history better illustrates the power of this tradition and the fierce rivalries it could ignite than the siege of New Carthage in 209 BC, during the darkest days of the Second Punic War. Rome was fighting for its survival against Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian genius who had crossed the Alps with his elephants and inflicted a series of catastrophic defeats on the Roman legions in Italy. While Hannibal ravaged the Italian peninsula, a young Roman commander named Publius Cornelius Scipio later, to earn the immortal surname Africanus, was dispatched to Spain with a seemingly impossible mission: to break Carthaginian power in Iberia and cut off Hannibal's supply lines and reinforcements. Scipio was only 25 years old, untested in independent command, and faced with 3 separate Carthaginian armies in Spain, each one larger than his own force. But Scipio possessed a mind of extraordinary brilliance, a gift for bold and unconventional strategy, and an understanding of human psychology that would have made him formidable in any age. Rather than engage the 3 Carthaginian armies one by one, risking defeat in detail, Scipio conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would ignore the armies entirely and strike directly at New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, the Carthaginian capital in Spain. New Carthage was the jewel of Carthaginian and Iberia, the main port through which supplies, silver, and reinforcements flowed. It held the Carthaginian war treasury, vast stores of weapons and grain, and hundreds of hostages taken from Spanish tribes to ensure their loyalty to Carthage. If Scipio could take New Carthage, he would cripple the Carthaginian war effort in Spain at a single stroke. But New Carthage was formidably defended, situated on a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water, with strong walls and a garrison that, while not enormous, was more than sufficient to hold the fortifications. Scipio moved with astonishing speed, marching his army 300 miles in just 7 days, arriving before the city, before any of the three Carthaginian field armies even knew he had moved. It was a masterstroke of operational surprise, but the hardest part still lay ahead. The walls of New Carthage still had to be breached, and they had to be breached quickly, before the Carthaginian armies could converge on Scipio and crush him against the city's defenses. Scipio launched his assault with characteristic precision and daring. He sent a force of 2,000 men, carrying scaling ladders against the eastern wall of the city, while simultaneously exploiting a piece of intelligence that would prove decisive. Local fishermen had told him that the lagoon on the city's northern side became shallow enough to wade across at low tide, a fact unknown to the defenders. Scipio sent a select force of 500 men with ladders through the lagoon at the critical moment, and these men arrived at an undefended section of wall on the north side, scaled it without opposition, and poured into the city from an entirely unexpected direction. But before this flanking force decided the battle, the fighting on the eastern wall had already produced one of the most famous disputes over military honor in Roman history. As the ladders went up against the eastern wall, two soldiers surged ahead of their comrades, each determined to be the first to reach the top. Their names were Quintus Trebellius and Sextus Digitus, and their rivalry would become the stuff of legend. Quintus Trebellius was a legionary, an ordinary soldier of the line, a man of no particular birth or social distinction, the kind of man who formed the backbone of the Roman army and whose name would normally have vanished into the anonymity of history. Sextus Digitus was a marine, a sailor-soldier who served with the Roman fleet and who was equally determined to claim the honor for himself and for the naval contingent he represented. As the assault began, both men threw themselves at the ladders with reckless abandon, climbing through a storm of missiles, scrambling over the bodies of fallen comrades, driven by a fury of ambition that seemed to render them immune to fear. The ancient sources describe a scene of almost unimaginable intensity, arrows striking the wall around them, stones crashing down from above, the screams of the wounded and the dying filling the air. And through it all, Trebellius and Digitus climbed, each one stealing glances at the other, each one pushing himself beyond the limits of endurance to gain even a single run's advantage. Both men reached the top of the wall at almost the same moment, and both immediately claimed the honor of having been first. The dispute was fierce and public, and it threatened to become a serious source of discord within Scipio's army. Each man had his supporters, the legionaries rallying behind Trebellius, the marines championing Digitus, and the argument over who had truly been first grew so heated that it reached the ears of Scipio himself. The young commander, displaying the political acumen that would later make him one of the most powerful men in Rome, resolved the dispute with Solomonic wisdom. He awarded the corona moralis to both men, declaring that each had shown equal valor and that both deserved the honor. It was a decision that satisfied neither party entirely, but prevented the rivalry from tearing his army apart at a critical moment in the campaign. The siege of New Carthage was a complete success, a victory that altered the course of the Second Punic War and launched Scipio on the path to his ultimate triumph over Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. But the story of Trebellius and Digitus endured long after the strategic consequences of the siege had faded from public memory, because it captured something essential about the Roman spirit, the belief that individual valor, displayed at the moment of greatest danger, was the highest expression of a man's worth, and that the pursuit of such glory was worth any risk, even the near certainty of death. What was it actually like to climb that ladder? What did a man experience in the moments between leaving the ground and reaching the battlements, or, far more likely, falling back to the earth with an arrow in his throat or a crushed skull? The physical reality of the escalade was a nightmare of exertion, terror, and violence compressed into a span of minutes or even seconds. Consider the conditions. A Roman legionary in full combat equipment carried approximately 60 to 70 pounds of gear: his lorica segmentata, or chainmail, his bronze helmet, his heavy rectangular shield, his gladius short sword, his pugio dagger, and various other items. To climb a ladder under these conditions required extraordinary physical strength and endurance, even without the added complication of people trying to kill you at every step. The ladders themselves were crude affairs, simple wooden constructions that were often too short for the walls they were meant to scale, forcing soldiers to climb at a dangerous angle or to leap for the battlements from the top rung. The ladders swayed and bounced under the weight of multiple climbers, and defenders frequently pushed them away from the wall with forked poles, sending entire lines of men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs and splintering wood. For the man at the top of the ladder, the man who aspired to be first on the wall, the dangers multiplied exponentially. He was the most visible target, the most exposed, and the most vulnerable. Defenders concentrated their fire on the leading climber, loosing arrows at point-blank range, hurling stones and heavy objects directly down onto his head, thrusting spears at his face and hands as he struggled to haul himself over the parapet. If he reached the top, he arrived in a state of near-total physical exhaustion, gasping for breath, muscles burning, vision narrowed by the confines of his helmet, and he found himself utterly alone on a wall crowded with enemies who were fresh, rested, and fighting on familiar ground. He had no room to maneuver, no comrades to guard his flanks, and no retreat. The ladder behind him was packed with other climbers, and to go back was as impossible as to go forward. He had to fight, and he had to survive long enough for other soldiers to join him and establish a foothold. Most did not survive those first terrible seconds. The ancient sources are filled with accounts of men who reached the top of the wall only to be cut down immediately, their bodies tumbling back onto the men climbing below, sometimes bringing the entire ladder down with them. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical danger. Modern studies of combat psychology have shown that the stress of close-quarters fighting produces effects that are remarkably consistent across time and culture: tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, time distortion, and a profound sense of unreality that can paralyze even the bravest soldier. For the man on the siege ladder, these effects were compounded by the knowledge that he was climbing toward almost certain death, that every rung brought him closer to a violence so intense and so personal that no amount of training could fully prepare him for it. The defenders were not distant figures. They were men whose faces he could see, whose breath he could feel, whose hatred was focused entirely on him. And yet, some men sought this experience. Some men craved it. Understanding why requires a deeper examination of what glory meant in the Roman world, and what it could buy a man who possessed it. In Roman society, military valor was not merely admired. It was the foundation upon which the entire social and political order rested. The concept of virtus, a word that is often translated simply as courage or manliness, but that encompassed a far broader range of qualities, including excellence, moral integrity, and devotion to duty, was the supreme Roman virtue, the quality that distinguished the true Roman from the barbarian, the citizen from the slave, the leader from the led. Virtus was not something a man was born with. It was something he demonstrated again and again through his actions on the battlefield. A man who displayed virtus in combat earned not only the respect of his peers, but also tangible rewards that could transform his entire life and the lives of his descendants. The Roman military decoration system was, in effect, a system of social mobility, a mechanism by which men of humble birth could rise to positions of influence and authority that would otherwise have been utterly closed to them. Consider the case of Quintus Trebellius, the legionary who fought Sextus Digitus for the honor of being first on the wall at New Carthage. Before that day, Trebellius was nobody, a common soldier, one of thousands, a man whose name appeared on no monument and whose opinion counted for nothing in the councils of the powerful. After that day, he was a hero, a recipient of the corona moralis, a man whose name was recorded by historians and whose deed was held up as an example for future generations. The wall crown did not merely bring him fame. It brought him concrete social and economic advantages. Recipients of major military decorations received increased pay, preferential treatment in the distribution of war spoils, and, perhaps most importantly, a public reputation that opened doors in Roman civic life. A decorated veteran could leverage his military fame into political influence, business connections, and advantageous marriages. He could secure appointments to local magistracies, gain the patronage of powerful senators, and establish his family on a trajectory of upward mobility that might, over the course of a few generations, carry his descendants into the ranks of the equestrian order, or even the Senate itself. The wall crown was, in this sense, not just a symbol of bravery, but a key that unlocked the rigid hierarchies of Roman class structure. In a society where birth and wealth determined almost everything, military glory offered one of the few paths by which a man could transcend the circumstances of his origin and write his own destiny. This was the prize that awaited at the top of the siege ladder. Not just a golden crown, but a new life, a new identity, a new place in the world. And it was this prize, as much as any innate courage or patriotic fervor, that drove men to climb. But it would be a mistake to reduce the motivations of these soldiers to mere social calculation. The desire for glory in the Roman world was not simply a rational cost-benefit analysis. It was a deeply emotional and spiritual impulse, rooted in the Roman understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. The Romans believed that a man's worth was measured not by the years he lived, but by the deeds he performed, and that a short life crowned with glory was infinitely preferable to a long life lived in obscurity. This belief was not merely a philosophical abstraction. It was a living creed that shaped the daily conduct of Roman soldiers and infused even the most mundane aspects of military life with a sense of sacred purpose. The Roman legion was, in many ways, a machine for producing heroes, an institution that systematically cultivated the desire for individual distinction, while simultaneously channeling it into the service of the collective. Every legion had its traditions, its roll of honor, its stories of past heroism that were told and retold around campfires until they became part of the unit's collective identity. Young soldiers grew up hearing tales of men who had won the Corona Moralis or the Corona Civica, men who had been first on the wall, or who had saved a comrade's life at the risk of their own, and these stories fired their imaginations and fed their ambitions. The desire to emulate these heroes, to add one's own name to the legion's roll of glory, was a powerful motivating force that commanders understood and deliberately exploited. When Scipio ordered the assault on New Carthage, he knew that his soldiers would compete with each other for the honor of being first on the wall. And he knew that this competition would drive them to feats of courage that no amount of discipline or coercion could produce. The promise of the Corona Moralis was, in effect, a force multiplier, a psychological weapon that transformed ordinary men into extraordinary warriors. The Roman military system understood something that many modern institutions have forgotten: that human beings are motivated not only by fear and material reward, but also by the desire for recognition, for honor, for the knowledge that their actions matter and will be remembered. The Corona Moralis gave soldiers something to fight for that transcended the immediate tactical situation, a vision of themselves as heroes, as men who had proven their worth in the ultimate test. And this vision gave them the strength to climb those terrible ladders even when every rational calculation argued for staying on the ground. The interplay between individual heroism and collective discipline was one of the defining tensions of Roman military culture, and nowhere was this tension more visible than on the walls of a besieged city. The Roman army was, above all, an army of discipline. Its strength lay not in the individual prowess of its soldiers, though many were formidable warriors, but in the coordination, training, and esprit de corps that allowed legions to fight as cohesive units, adapting to the chaos of battle with a flexibility and resilience that their enemies could rarely match. The escalade, however, was a moment when the collective gave way to the individual. When the coordinated machine of the Legion dissolved into a series of desperate individual struggles on ladders and walls, and when the outcome depended not on the discipline of the unit, but on the courage and skill of individual men. This was both the glory and the danger of the assault. Roman commanders understood that the escalade was inherently chaotic, that once the ladders went up and the men began to climb, the neat formations and careful tactics of conventional warfare became irrelevant, and everything depended on the willingness of individual soldiers to push forward into the killing zone. This is why the Corona Moralis existed, not merely as a reward for bravery, but as a deliberate institutional mechanism for incentivizing the kind of individual risk-taking that the escalade demanded. By offering the highest possible honor to the first man on the wall, the Roman military system ensured that there would always be volunteers for the most dangerous assignment in warfare, men who would compete with each other for the privilege of climbing into the jaws of death. It was a system of breathtaking psychological sophistication, one that harnessed the deepest human desires for recognition, for status, for immortality, and directed them toward the specific tactical goal of breaching an enemy's fortifications. The man who climbed the ladder was, in one sense, acting entirely for himself, driven by personal ambition and the dream of glory. But, in another sense, he was acting for Rome, serving as the spearhead of the collective will, the human battering ram that opened the way for the legion to pour through the breach. This duality, the individual hero serving the collective purpose, was the essence of Roman military greatness, and it found its purest expression in the figure of the first man on the wall. The story of Trebellius and Digitus at New Carthage was neither the first nor the last such story in Roman military history, but it endured because it captured the Roman imagination in a way that transcended the specific circumstances of the siege. It was a story about what it meant to be Roman, about the values that defined the culture, the ambitions that drove its citizens, and the sacrifices that built the empire. In the centuries that followed the fall of New Carthage, the Corona Moralis continued to be awarded, and the tradition of the first man on the wall continued to inspire acts of extraordinary courage. During the siege of Numantia in 133 BC, the brutal final campaign against the last free Celtiberian city in Spain, Roman soldiers competed fiercely for the honor of being first over the walls. During Julius Caesar's siege of Avaricum in 52 BC, his legionaries stormed the walls of the Gallic fortress in a driving rainstorm, fighting hand-to-hand on rain-slicked battlements, each man desperate to be the first to plant his feet on the enemy's defenses. The tradition persisted because it served a vital cultural function. It reinforced the values of virtus and gloria that were central to Roman identity. It provided a narrative framework within which individual soldiers could understand their own experiences and find meaning in the brutal reality of ancient warfare. And it created a chain of heroic examples that stretched back through the generations, linking each new generation of soldiers to the heroes of the past and inspiring them to seek the same glory. The Corona Moralis was not just a military decoration. It was a cultural artifact, a physical embodiment of the values that made Rome great, and that sustained the Roman military machine through centuries of continuous warfare. When a soldier donned the golden crown with its miniature battlements, he was not merely wearing a prize. He was wearing the history of Rome itself, the accumulated glory of every man who had ever climbed a siege ladder and lived to tell the tale. The influence of this tradition extended far beyond the battlefield and deep into the political life of the Roman Republic and Empire. Military decorations were a form of political currency in Rome, and the Corona Moralis was among the most valuable coins in circulation. A man who wore the wall crown commanded automatic respect in public life, and his opinions carried weight in political debates and legal proceedings. Families that could boast of an ancestor who had won the Corona Moralis displayed his image, typically a wax death mask or a majo in the atrium of the family home, where it served as both a source of pride and a standard of excellence for future generations. During funeral processions, these masks were worn by actors who impersonated the deceased ancestors, parading through the streets of Rome in a public display of the family's accumulated glory. A family with a Corona Moralis recipient among its ancestors was a family of distinction, and the political advantages that flowed from this distinction could last for centuries. The decoration also carried religious and symbolic weight. The crown itself, with its turreted design, evoked the walls of the city, and by extension the goddess Cybele, who was often depicted wearing a similar crown, the corona territa, as a symbol of her role as protector of cities. To wear the corona moralis was, in a sense, to partake of the divine, to claim a symbolic kinship with the gods who watched over cities and civilizations. This religious dimension added an additional layer of prestige to an already extraordinary honor, and ensured that the wall crown occupied a place in Roman consciousness that transcended the merely military. It was a sacred object, a talisman of power and virtue, and its possession marked a man as someone who had been touched by the favor of the gods. As the Roman Republic gave way to the empire, the tradition of the corona moralis evolved but never entirely disappeared. Under the emperors, military decorations became increasingly tied to the imperial system of patronage and reward, and the corona moralis was sometimes awarded by the emperor himself as a mark of personal favor. But the essential meaning of the award remained unchanged. It was the supreme recognition of individual valor in the most dangerous form of combat, and its recipients were regarded with a reverence that no other military honor could match. Even as the nature of Roman warfare changed, as siege warfare became more sophisticated, as engineering and technology reduced the need for direct escalade, the cultural memory of the first man on the wall endured. It endured because it spoke to something fundamental in the Roman character, something that transcended the specific tactics and technologies of any particular era. It spoke to the belief that courage is the highest virtue, that honor is worth more than life, and that the deeds of the brave deserve to be remembered forever. Roman writers and historians, from Polybius to Livy to Pliny the Elder, recorded the names and deeds of corona moralis recipients with a care and reverence that they reserved for the most important events in Roman history. These accounts ensure that the tradition survived the fall of Rome itself, passing into the literary heritage of Western civilization and inspiring later generations of soldiers, writers, and thinkers. The medieval concept of chivalry, with its emphasis on individual valor, personal honor, and the pursuit of glory in combat, owed a profound, though often unacknowledged debt to the Roman tradition of the first man on the wall. The knight, who sought to be first through the breach at a medieval siege, was, whether he knew it or not, following in the footsteps of Trebellius and Digitus, driven by the same hunger for glory, the same desire to prove his worth in the ultimate test of courage. When modern nations award their highest military decorations, the Medal of Honor, the Victoria Cross, the Croix de Guerre, they are participating in a tradition that stretches back, through an unbroken chain of influence and inspiration, to the Golden Crown with its miniature battlements that was placed on the head of the first Roman soldier to stand upon an enemy's wall. And so we return to the foot of the wall, to the moment before the climb, to the soldier who stands with his ladder in his hands and his heart in his throat, staring up at the battlements where death awaits. What is he thinking? What is he feeling? We cannot know for certain, because the men who climbed those ladders left us no diaries, no letters, no first-hand accounts of their inner experience. We have only the bare facts recorded by historians, the names, the dates, the outcomes, and the knowledge that these men were human beings, subject to the same fears and hopes and desires that move us today. Perhaps the soldier at the base of the wall is thinking of the golden crown, of the cheers of his comrades, of the new life that awaits him if he survives. Perhaps he is thinking of his family, of the honor he will bring to his father's name and the legacy he will leave his sons. Perhaps he is thinking of nothing at all, his mind empty by the overwhelming immediacy of the moment, his body moving on instinct and training, carrying him upward, rung toward whatever fate awaits. Or perhaps, in the deepest chamber of his heart, he is thinking of something that transcends all calculation and all ambition, the simple, terrible, magnificent desire to prove to himself and to the world that he is not afraid, that he is worthy, that he is, in the fullest sense of the word, a man. The Romans had a phrase for this: alt vincere, alt mori, conquer or die. It was not a motto of despair, but of defiance, a declaration that there are things worth more than survival, that the quality of a life matters more than its length, and that the man who chooses to face death rather than dishonor has already won his victory, regardless of the outcome. The first man on the wall embodied this philosophy in its purest and most extreme form. He was the living proof that human courage can transcend human fear, that the desire for glory can overcome the instinct for self-preservation, and that the willingness to risk everything for a single moment of supreme achievement is the quality that separates the extraordinary from the ordinary, the remembered from the forgotten, the immortal from the merely alive. 2,000 years have passed since Quintus Trebellius and Sextus Digitus raced each other up the walls of New Carthage, and the world they knew has long since crumbled into dust. The walls they climbed are gone. The city they conquered has been buried beneath centuries of subsequent habitation, and the empire they served has passed into the realm of history and legend. But their story endures, preserved in the pages of Polybius and Livy, passed down through the centuries by scholars and storytellers who recognized in it something timeless and universal. It endures because it is, at its core, a story about what it means to be human, about the lengths to which people will go in pursuit of honor, about the sacrifices they will make for a moment of transcendence, and about the societies that are built on the foundation of such sacrifices. The first man on the wall was not just a Roman phenomenon. He was an archetype, a figure who appears in every culture and every age, wherever men and women face the ultimate test of courage and choose to meet it rather than retreat. He is the firefighter who enters the burning building, the soldier who throws himself on the grenade, the ordinary person who, in the crucible of crisis, discovers within themselves a capacity for heroism that they never knew they possessed. The corona moralis may be an artifact of a vanished civilization, but the values it represented, courage, honor, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself, are as alive today as they were when the first Roman legionary gripped the rungs of his ladder and began to climb. We remember these men not because they were Romans, but because they were human, and because their story reminds us of what we are capable of at our best and our bravest. The wall still stands, in metaphor if not in stone, and the ladder still waits. The only question, now as then, is who will be the first to climb.